Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to episode 144.3. This is our third attempt with some brand new equipment and a little bit of new software. And in some cases, Jason, some uninstalled, reinstalled device drivers here in Colorado, some brand new equipment we just unboxed in Columbus, Ohio. Jason's got a brand new monitor in basically Dallas, Texas area. So, Jason, without further ado, what are we going to talk about today?
So today we're going to go back to our roots. We're going to talk about, when we first started this 3.5 years ago, one of the things we said as part of the designing goal of having a weekly cadence on these live streams was when new stuff breaks, right? News, research, whatever, that we'd be able to be agile on bringing it up and talking about what we think it means. Especially as two former analysts, whenever new stuff comes out from the other folks that are analysts as well, it's always fun to kind of look in and see, do we see the same things that they do, and vice versa. Now, in this case, I'm guessing you have a lot of perspectives on, do you see what they see? Because this is your old stomping ground, Dave.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The 24 years that this Magic Quadrant in the backup space has been around, I think that I'm the only person that's been involved in that as either the vendor, lead author, or now as a vendor again. Jason, a long time ago, about a dozen years ago, this was the first Magic Quadrant to be produced that has these movable sliders where you can actually change the weighting associated with the different criteria. The ability to execute, if you're not familiar, that's just the y-axis here. The completeness of vision, that's the x-axis. The criteria you see listed here, which has a textual representation behind it, is in the document, meaning the MQ overall. This sort of stock blue, Jason, these are the default settings. So you can see the Gartner analysts, they took sales and execution pricing, put that about halfway. They've got other things like customer experience all the way. You've got something, though, like a marketing, incredibly low, about as low as you can get. Pick a slider, and we're just going to move it around and see what happens.
Yeah, I for those folks that are first seeing this, the first time that I saw this view, it truly blew my mind. I mean, first of all, when I first started using the Magic Quadrant, I'm sure some vendor gave it to me and said, hey, if your product shows up in the upper right, it's a good product. And if your product isn't in the upper right, then maybe it's not as good. First and foremost, let's talk about the fact that it's not about product. It's about company and the completeness of the offerings across the company. But then the other thing is, I think a lot of folks are used to just seeing some black and white lines, couple dots, call it good. In fact, the internet often will talk about, it's like, it's not about the dots, right? Don't believe the dots. And I think it's interesting that in a good, better, best, there is the dots on a chart. There is the text, download the report, right? There's some interesting things about why each dot is where it is. And then there's this really cool view that unfortunately you don't have to be a Gartner subscriber to get to. But these sliders actually are really interesting because it kind of shows what the Gartner analysts think are the important things that matter in 2023. Your values and importance might actually, or priorities might differ. Let's talk about that for a second. Anyway, first comments, product versus company, and then let's get nerdy on some of these sliders.
Yeah, so go ahead and just pick one. We're going to move it around. We can talk through what happens and why.
So a lot of these, I think, are pretty self-describing, right? So the product's important, right? So that top one is all the way to the far right. Some of these, like market responsiveness, execution, as the leader fourth year in a row on the ability to execute, I kind of wish all the execution ones were all the way up to the right. Not saying. But I will ask as a genuine question the first time I saw it, viability. Now, I don't want to pick on anything here, but I'm not sure I understand wholly what is that? What do they mean by that? And then why should we be thinking about that as one of the ones which is interesting that they have prioritized?
Yeah, viability is not necessarily the company's overall viability. It's the viability or commitment in this particular market, the backup.
All right.
Backup software solutions market in this case. So it's interesting if you take viability, which is very highly weighted, and let's just zero it out and see what happens. Now, first thing you'll notice is stuff turns orange, and that just says we made a change from the default, right? Now here, hang with me, Jason, and everyone out there, because it's going to sound a little counterintuitive. We took viability from very high to very, very low. And some dots moved here. The shaded gray is where the original position was. If you reduce overall viability, Some
meaning that
of
it's
these
not
vendors,
important anymore
that's
to the
right.
judging, right?
That's right. You take it down, or at least reduce as much as you can out of the overall evaluation. The vendor actually goes up. Now I'm going to have to mention anything we do around execute, since Veeam, like you said, is highest 4 years in a row in ability to execute. We're the anchor for that top spot. We're not going to move no matter what we do on that axis.
So let me play that back. So on the ability to execute, so that's in the y-axis,
Yep.
the two boundary vendors, Veeam on the top, OpenText on the bottom, those two won't change, but everything in between will, because those are the two boundaries on how ability to execute works. So then when we play with the sliders on the bottom, the boundary vendors on the far right and far left won't change, and everyone else plays. Is that the right way to think about that?
That's the right way to think of it, because it's a relative scaling to these four anchor dimensions. OpenText happens to be an anchor for two of them. The
Yeah.
down low, down to or over to the left, Veeam up on the top here. And what's interesting is if you notice, like Rubrik goes up, Veritas kind of goes up, Cohesity goes up if you reduce viability. That's meaning that Gartner's evaluation is that they're not as viable as some of the other leaders are. Like Dell doesn't move, Veeam doesn't move, Veritas only moves a little bit. You can see some others in other quadrants move. But to your point, if you take some of these other slides, like let's just take everything that was kind of halfway evaluated or weighted, and we're just going to max them all out. Now you'll notice Veeam and others move further over to the right when you actually end up doing that. You increase in vision. If we just kind of reset all these guys again here, the criteria.
Okay. And again, so the ones that are on the far right and left edges, they don't move.
They don't move.
And then on that axis, everything else moves relative to that. Out of curiosity, during your years running the Magic Quadrant, you said this was the first one that had the sliders on it. Why, when you were an analyst, did you choose certain levers to weight in the way that you did? How does that kind of come about?
Yeah, there's a difference, and you can actually kind of get a peek into the philosophy of the authoring analysts. So during my 12-ish, 13, almost 13 years, I really believe that a lot of the technologies were getting to be somewhat similar. Things like marketing, customer support, sales reach, what kind of verticals, those would oftentimes differentiate your product. And for example, just give you like, a real world scenario. In 2005, when I started Gartner, and there's only a 30-minute time limit for your inquiry calls, someone would say, here are all my requirements. And they're like, back then it was pretty easy. Like there's only a couple vendors that could do that. There's not that many products on the market. Now you fast forward, 13 years later, it's like, well, I want to back up 500 virtual machines, and I've got 500 physical Windows, Linux as well. And I also want SQL Server and Oracle. Like, well, okay, literally almost every single vendor on this Magic Quadrant could do that. And we could argue how well they do it. They do it a little differently. But that's when it started to seem like different kind of criteria were important. These analysts, their view is things like sales, marketing, things like your business model, your vertical, your geographic strategy aren't as important. So they're heavily weighting product and minimizing non-product.
Now, does that, I don't know if this is a good segue or not, but, one of the things, and I love how you always talk about you owe it to yourself to get educated, the box and the dots is not the whole story, right? There's some text from the report that also kind of gleans into what the analysts prioritize, as well as what the perception is of each of the vendors that are represented. Does it make sense for us to take a few minutes and kind of look at where was Veeam in that?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And it's a great point because, the analysts try to be very equal in terms of the amount of text. And this particular Magic Quadrant has been very faithful to have 3 strengths and 3 cautions for every vendor to offer a little bit additional guidance. So there's the Veeam text is positioned here, talks about the number of releases in the last year, which Veeam had 24 at 24. Also talks about repackaging into the Veeam data platform. So strengths, loyal, satisfied customer base. Yep. Largest deployed solution in the market at 450,000 customers, over 1 million active Veeam backup and replication instances. Hybrid and multi-cloud support listed highly there, as well as Large network of partners and MSPs. Now, Jason, this one's interesting. That's the strength, right? Large number of partners and managed service providers. If you go to the caution, though, some of the things that are mentioned in the first one, caution is slow to respond to key market trends such as backup as a service, SaaS-based control plane. So some of these things, are interesting that they're positioned as both. I know that you've got a thought on as a service.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks, when we look at as a service, and of course, you and I were both analysts back when as a service, especially data protection as a service and the subsets of backup as a service and DR as a service, when that first came about. But in my mind, it's never been about where should the data live, right? Bottom line for me, get your data out of the building, right? If you want to put it in a hyperscale, you want to put it in a managed cloud, you want to put it in a colo. I don't care. Just get your data out of the building, right? By the way, put it in a tape. Put in some nice guy in a white van will come and get your tapes outside. Get your tapes or get your data out of the building. To me, the biggest value that comes from backup as a service and DR as a service is not that the data left the building. It's that it's better curated and monitored and managed by experts that live and breathe in that all day long. And so in our case, we've always thought the closer that those experts are to the customer, the better the outcome is going to be. So, I don't want an army of professional services going and doing these deployments. I want Joe at the MSP who knows that customer, who sold that product. I want them to be the experts because they're going to be the first ones to get the call when everything goes bad. And so I like the fact that I have a large partner network. And for me, that's expertise, not just points of transaction, which is how we chose to fulfill as a service. Are there some things that you could do better if it had the Veeam brand on the top? Maybe. But expertise and ensuring an outcome, I don't think is one of them. My opinion.
Yeah, fair point. Fair point. The next one's sort of interesting on the caution. Now, this is 3 years in a row they've had the exact same text, which is complexity, which I find interesting because oftentimes people say they chose Veeam because it's so intuitive or so easy. But here it says some Gartner clients indicate that Veeam can be more complex, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I would just say on that, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Being the market share leader, which we'll get to in a little bit, it's probably not a gating variable if there's a million active Veeam backup and replication instances out there. But, that is what that is. And then
Sure.
Secure implementation by requirement or by, I guess, design, but by implementation requirements or specific. So I know you had a thought on that as well.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing that look, it's you, in all fairness, it's kind of like when you go out to restaurants, if you're willing to give negative feedback to the wait staff, you have to be willing to at the same rate give positive feedback, right? So we can't say we love everything about the Magic Quadrant except those things we disagree with. So let's give it that balanced view. But in my case, when I read the one on secure by implementation, there was a couple of years ago, different set of Gartner analysts, by the way, but there was a couple of years ago where the priorities seemed to be around if it wasn't an appliance, it wasn't secure, right? And the appliance has never been the default form factor in the data protection space. In the 34 years each of us has been doing this, appliance was never it. It's wonderful for day zero. Right. It's wonderful as far as shrinking the deployment clock itself a little bit. And there's other ways you can do that, but that's one of them. But I'm not sure that a hardened stack out of the cardboard is not easily equivalent to harden your stack along the way, because the guidance they're giving here is implementing a secure anything in IT requires clients to thoughtfully design, configure, and manage the deployment to mitigate cyber threats. Right, and integrating immutability and detection by third-party solutions. Doesn't matter what you're deploying. That should be the guidance. Is your data going to be immutably or survivably secure? Are you going to be using detection technologies from third parties? You deploy anything in IT, that should be the guidance, including when you're deploying a backup solution. So in my mind, it's kind of a mom and apple pie thing. You get a little bit of a gold star on it if you deploy it as an appliance because you can claim the stack is hardened without you having to do diligence on it. But if you're trusting the appliance to be hardened, and that's the only thing you're doing, I teach shooting sports. When I teach shooting sports, I say never assume it's safe. Never assume the safety. Never assume it's unloaded. don't assume that your appliance is hardened and that you're not going to have to do maintenance on it after the fact. That might be mixing metaphors, but hopefully it comes through.
Well, a funny comment on that. I actually did see the service documentation, field documentation for one of the appliances. You know what the default password is for the node?
I don't want to know.
Its password. So make sure
Nice.
that gets updated as well. Just to round out a little bit, here's some history. I know that appreciate these dots look really small. So I'll just, we've talked about Veeam, but if I go back to just the main published version, what's interesting to see is some changes over time. So in the last 4 years, IBM's actually been in 3 quadrants. They've gone from leader to challenger, and then challenger again, and then now visionary, which is sort of interesting year over year. How do you go from challenger to visionary? Because it sort of says in 12 months, did your execution radically change and your vision improve, or was it the other way around? So that's the most dramatic shift I've ever seen in a Magic Quadrant, and
Or did
hard
they
to get
just
your head
change
around
all
a
the
little bit.
scoring criteria? Right? I mean,
Yeah, but they didn't. So it's interesting that one vendor moved that much. The other one, and I think you'll appreciate this, OpenText. Actually, OpenText got purchased the assets of Micro Focus that completed earlier this year. Poor OpenText, though, they barely moved up or to the right. And OpenText, prior to buying the Micro Focus assets, had Carbonite. Now, Jason, you're going to recognize some of these product names. In addition to Carbonite's own backup, Carbonite had been on a bit of an acquisition tear. They bought Data Castle, they bought eVault, Mozy, Zamanda. They also had Mailstore and WebRoot on the security and archiving front. But you know what else they had? A product DoubleTake.
Yeah. Yeah, admittedly, when I first saw this year's quadrant, my first instinct actually was, wow, there's a new player on the field. How cool is this? OpenText. I wonder what they're shipping. And then I had to go look up and realize it's an island of misfit toys. But and I love my friends over at DoubleTake. There's still a few over there, but yeah, that is kind of surprising. It also kind of stinks to debut near the bottom with a new name. Anyway, all right, we could poke fun at many different elements along the way and kind of make some comments on this. It's also fair to kind of point out, though, that Gartner is not always the holy grail and ubiquitous exclusive single source of what does the market landscape look like. So as long as we're doing a talk on where the market landscape looks, there's another piece of data that also recently came out as well. Can we show that one as well and kind of get your thoughts?
Yeah, so IDC, I mean, arguably the two best known analyst firms
Sure.
are IDC and Gartner from a name recognition perspective. So just a couple of weeks ago, IDC published a new report. The title's listed over there on the left-hand side. And looking at what they call the data replication and protection software market. So data replication, self-describing, but that also, Jason, does include array-based or hardware-based replication as well. So vendors like Dell and IBM, for example, that
Sure.
sell replication or storage arrays, they get to that benefit. And then protection just means backup. So that's a way to read that. The interesting thing in the title is a flip at the top. And I'll let you kind of double click on that.
Yeah, so a couple years ago, actually, I think it was a couple years ago, there was another tie, right? So the way the IDC does this is they measure overall market share, and then if there are two vendors within 0.5% of each other in representation, they call that a statistical tie. What the flip at the top is basically saying is that this is the second time that there have been two vendors that have been statistically nearly equal, and yet when you actually move to the right of the decimal point, there is a flipping between the first and second. And the way I try to describe this, and I want to be completely fair, just in case someone from the other folks are listening in, to my mind, it's kind of like when you have twins. When you have twins, yes, they're both twins. They both have the same birth date. And yet I guarantee on any set of twins, everybody knows which one came out first. Right? Only by a few minutes, or in this case, less than 0.5% in market share. But you always kind of know they keep track of that along the way. And so basically what we're basically saying on the announcement here is, which twin came out first actually, it got flipped for this year. Um, I'm going to get nerdy, and Dave, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, because in my mind, you need to have a half point of variance between any two places to call it good. In this case, I think the math was actually 0.43, so we're 0.07 away from a definitive first versus second, if I recall. But what actually to me is probably more interesting is, of the two that are tied, and it's hard to say it that way, but of the two that are tied, look on the right-hand side. One of them grew at 9.4% year over year in the upper right-hand corner, compared with the market grew at 4.4. So one of them doubled their year over year growth compared to the market average. The other one shrank by 2%. So if you're split by 0.43, one of them is growing at more than double the market rate, one of them is actually shrinking in market rate. I like the chances of a definitive first versus second on the next run rate. Is my math wrong, or am I thinking about this the right way?
No, I mean that is factually accurate, and one of the things I always think it's really interesting in this market. It's very unique. I mean, I've never known of any market, and much less in IT, where the market share leader has a dozen percentage points or less. So here, let's just say it's a tie, and the co-leaders are 11.8 and 11.4. Usually, you think of a leader in a market as being dominant by 3 times, maybe even higher than that. So it is showing that the market is definitely shifting. Obviously, the market's shifting compared to when you and I were back in industry or in analysts, because they were a different set and a different mix of ordering of who the top vendors were. So share shift is happening, to your point, and it's happening at a pretty significant pace. And what we're actually, I think, is interesting is that rest of market is almost 43%. When Veeam first made $1 billion, now going back over 4 years ago, well, soon to be 5 years ago, our co-founder said, well, where do we get the next billion from? And I thought, well, here, look at these numbers. If it's an $11.5 billion market today, and we're getting about $1.5 billion of it, I think I know where we can get another billion more.
It's interesting as we've watched this trend, and again, you and I have been on the other side of the aisle, on the analyst side. We've served actually almost every vendor that's on this list in different ways over the years in different capacities. It is amazing to me that there is an established group. Legacy may not be entirely the right term, but there's certainly some venerable vendors on here. But the fact that 2 out of 5 of backup dollars spent are in the everything else category, that 42% wedge. And by the way, the 42% wedge that is growing at 4.6% year over year, which is almost exactly on par with total market. So what you see is there's the everything else, which is aggregating out, too small to list, and yet makes up collectively 40% of the market space. And then you really see almost every vendor here is not keeping up to market. They're either radically overperforming or they're radically underperforming. And so they're really, all the shift is the stacking of those top 5 or 6 on the right-hand side. It's a weird market that comes with 30 years of history in it.
Yeah, great point. And if you were to actually take out the storage-based replication revenue, only one, that's Veeam actually, but only one of the top 5, because most of the reports only name the top 5 from IDC, only one's growing faster than or faster than market. To your point, others are growing slightly lower than market, or a couple going negative if you were actually to look at backup or protection software only. So it's going to be interesting to see how things shake out in the coming year. And what we can already say now, halfway through this year, is these trends seem to be persisting.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait a little bit longer to find out what happens when the 23 data is in, but it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I guess the homework for the kids at home, right? So there's a couple things that you can look at. This is dollars spent, just empirical. Where did people vote with their dollars? No marketing, no hype, where the dollars go, right? And that's a very different lens than the really deep dive that the other analyst firm puts into how you doing this, how you doing this, how you doing this, how many products came out, right? And even then, though, there's a weighting. And so, to your point earlier, you said that a lot of vendors do the basic stuff about the same. So you got to figure out, who you're going to trust, right? And what are the features and capabilities that matter most to you? Neither of these reports is going to say this is the best in every case. Go buy it. The homework is, how does it fit your environment? Dave, is that fair?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's fair. It's like trying on clothes. Buy the clothes that fit you, that are comfortable for you, not for somebody else.
Sounds good. Last thoughts?
Well, I think let's land the plane here. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Jason alluded to it, but you should go and download some of this research. Veeam actually has a URL, and we'll post it in the Twitter update as well as the LinkedIn. And Jason, I said Twitter. I mean the platform formerly known as Twitter, now called X. And we'll give you a link to go check out the Gartner Magic Quadrant and read the entire report. Read about all of the other vendors. Read about the different criteria and the description of that was used. To your point, Jason, get educated, make your own decisions.
Sounds good.
Thanks everyone for tuning in.
In 2023, innovation fueled every industry, from renewable energy to space travel, all powered by data. The world runs on data. It's worth more than oil, and inherent value brings inherent risk. Natural disasters, accidents, and ransomware attacks are increasingly prevalent. Years of globally impactful work can be erased in an instant. But not with us. With Veeam, your enterprise becomes radically resilient. We give you the power to restore any workload, anywhere, anytime, instantly, so you can meet every challenge head on. There's a reason over 80% of Fortune 500 companies work with us. We provide comprehensive recovery with tailored solutions that scale with you. When you partner with a global leader in data protection and ransomware recovery, you can bounce forward. Veeam. Radical resilience starts here.